All right, so Brian, if you will, sir, go ahead. The floor is yours.
Thanks so much. All right, hello everybody. I'm Brian, one of your teaching assistants here. So just some background from me while I set up. So I have my master's in biology. I did my research at the Salk Institute for Biological Studies, and I've been with Jared for 6 times now, I think. So it's great. It's a great team. And I'm also a certified personal trainer, so I
Favorite TA by
specialize
far.
in, thank you. And I also specialize in performance enhancement, corrective exercise, and behavior change as well. And also work in psychiatry with some docs and some nurse practitioners. So it kind of blends both worlds together, bio and psych. And I am currently a medical student at the University of Queensland, Ochsner. So my school will be in Queensland in Australia, and I'll be doing my rotations later in New Orleans, Louisiana. So if you ever have questions about health, pre-med, pre-nursing, feel free to let me know and visit my office hours. Cool. So let's get started. So we're going to finish up the second half of the systems of the body. So bear with me. So here's a general outline of what we'll go over today. Trust me, it might seem a little bit overwhelming, but I'll pretty much explain it thoroughly and tell you what you need to know pretty much. Okay. So first, let's go over anatomical directions because it's really important to be oriented with the brain in order to understand what I will be talking about and the locations of where hormones are released, okay? So just some review. So superior and inferior. So typically on top is superior, inferior is on the bottom. Lateral means away, medial towards the midline. And ventral toward the stomach, dorsal towards the backside or the tail, okay? Just for orientation. So again, this isn't biology class, so it won't be really tested on anatomy per se. And my face is in the way. So we have the horizontal plane or axial. We got the sagittal plane, as well as, you can see, coronal plane. There you go. This looks like a crown. Okay. So just to reorient everybody. So then we'll go straight into the endocrine system. Look at an overview of hormones. So just introduction. So the endocrine system is pretty much a chemical messenger system that relies on hormones to tell certain parts of your body to produce a certain molecule, neurotransmitter, and as well as to maintain homeostasis. So we'll be talking about homeostasis throughout the lecture because it's important to keep that homeostatic state, because if you get too hot, multiple functions in your body won't function properly. So then it has to regulate that body temperature as well. Same goes for hormones. So we'll be looking at the hypothalamus, which controls the pituitary gland, which secretes hormones to signal other glands to say, hey, you should release more glucagon since glucose is low. And we'll talk about more of these hormones later on. You also have the thyroid gland, which is important for metabolism. And you also have the adrenal gland. So recall the sympathetic system, right? So if you recall, I like to think of the 4 Fs when the sympathetic system is active. So the 4 Fs would be fight, flight, fright, and making love. So those 4 Fs, pretty much you're in a sympathetic state because you're trying to flee from danger or you feel threatened. You know, a lot of hormones will be released like cortisol to ramp up blood glucose production. And of course, we have our androgens and estrogens produced by testes and ovaries, as well as in the adrenal glands as well. So some locations of the hormones we'll be talking about. So like I said, in the hypothalamus, releases a lot of hormones, which signals the release of other hormones in other parts of the body. So we'll only look at a couple of these hormones, so no need to freak out. You don't need to memorize all of these, but we'll be looking at certain ones. For example, adrenocorticotropic hormone in the anterior pituitary gland. We'll be looking at gonadotropin releasing hormones, so in terms of your sex hormones, testosterone and estrogen, okay? And of course, we have glucagon and insulin from the pancreas gland. So the pancreas is an organ, but it also serves as a gland because in the pancreatic islets, it secretes glucagon and insulin. And of course, the adrenal gland, which is superior to the kidneys, right? And we have two main parts, the adrenal cortex and the adrenal medulla. So the adrenal cortex secretes glucocorticoids and mineralocorticoids. So for those who are studying for the MCAT, I like to remember, corticoids, so it comes from the cortex. And then you have your catecholamines, epinephrine and norepinephrine, which comes from the adrenal medulla. Okay, so the key hormones for the MCAT are the glucocorticoids and mineralocorticoids. So glucocorticoids like cortisol, mineralocorticoids like aldosterone. Okay. So now let's focus on the adrenal glands. So when it comes to stress, you know, our heart rate increases, say danger's approaching, we need to mobilize glucose so we have energy to run away from that mountain lion when you're out hiking. So you'll secrete these hormones in response to these stressors. So when we talk about stress, we have short-term stress and long-term stress. So for example, if a mountain lion is right in front of you, right, short-term stress, or the system, the sympathetic adrenal medullary system, which is pretty much a combo of the sympathetic nervous system and adrenal glands. So when you sense stress, there's danger, you know, mountain lions approaching, there's a neural impulse that will go through these nerves, pass through the spinal cord, and signal to your adrenal gland, hey, you need to secrete catecholamines like epinephrine, norepinephrine, we got to get out of here. So in that sense, your body wants to increase the heart rate, so blood flow can mobilize through your tissues, dilate bronchioles, so you can breathe a little faster, and all that other stuff that's needed to survive. However, say prolonged stress, so if you have a lot of stressors back in your childhood or adolescent or even in college, you know, too much work, you just feel overwhelmed and just a lot of burden upon on yourself and your schedule, then the system that we'll be talking about for the more prolonged stress will be the hypothalamic pituitary adrenocortical system, HPAC. Also in books, they would say HPA axis as well. So this is a combo of the adrenal cortex. So remember cortex, so corticoids, mineralocorticoids, glucocorticoids, and it restores the body at baseline. So allostasis is the ability for the body to return back to homeostasis based on the physiological responses that your body does, right? So in a sense, long-term stress, there are cons to it because it may cause weight gain, increase blood pressure. So if you're stressed, you tend to, you also like to binge eat. You also, have poor sleep. Your appetite's dysregulated. So it's all about homeostasis in a sense. So being in a prolonged state of stress is not that ideal. And for the HPAC, when stimulated by ACTH, so recall it's one of the hormones secreted by the hypothalamus, so adrenocorticotropic hormone ACTH, activates this cortex to release the hormone, the glucocorticoids. Okay, it's like cortisol. So let's focus a little bit more on glucocorticoids. So glucocorticoids, they're pretty much steroid hormones produced in the adrenal cortex. And like I said, you have glucocorticoids and mineralocorticoids. So glucocorticoids, cortisol goes hand in hand with regulating blood sugar, and aldosterone also helps with water retention and maintenance of blood pressure. So in a sense, like we talked about the immune system earlier, right? So in the sense of, in the event of stress, your hormones will tend to increase, right? But then at the same time, if you have a prolonged, if you're in a prolonged state of stress, you might suppress that immune system. So we'll study in psychoneuroimmunology later on in the course that stress does decrease the immune system. So typically people who experience a lot of burdens in their life, they tend to succumb to diseases and sickness due to the suppressed immune system. Okay. Let's see. And just to reiterate the benefits and drawbacks, right? At the moment of stress, right? Like the mountain lion, it is beneficial to have these hormones upregulated because you need to run away from the danger in order to survive. So that would be a benefit. However, the drawback, like I just mentioned, is that there's increased susceptibility to illness and disease. All right, and just to reiterate, it might be a lot of material, but just recall this is not a biology course. So as long as you get the main concept, and if you notice that I tend to repeat a lot of what I say, then it's pretty much what you need to know for the purpose of this course. But of course, if you're interested or if you want to study for the MCAT, then definitely pay attention, yeah. So in terms of hormones, like when you talk about prolonged stress, like I said, it might lead to weight gain because different hormones throughout your body, right? A decrease in testosterone, you have a decrease in T3, T4 from your thyroid, so your metabolism goes down. So if your metabolism goes down and you're pretty much consuming a lot of food, right? You're not gonna be burning off that excess weight. Also, sleep helps regulate that. And like I said, if you have an increase in cortisol, too much stress, just too much blood sugar in your body, your insulin receptors in your body, it won't respond. So in a sense, that would make you a diabetic, right? So type 1 diabetes is mainly, it's like a genetic factor where your insulin receptors just don't respond to insulin at all. Type 2 diabetes, there's just too much blood sugar, you're just constantly eating, you're just tiring out your pancreatic cells, and you just can't release insulin at all. And in a sense, that does lead to weight gain. So it's all about regulation. Just think of your body as like a thermostat. You always want to keep it at that sweet spot, not too high, not too low, right? It's like if it's really hot outside and you crank the AC like to max power, but then you'll get too cold. So then your body wants to heat back up, right? So in a sense, you should just like put that thermostat to a steady 70 degrees instead of just cranking it down to like 50 degrees. So it's all about regulation. So now let's talk about puberty. So when an individual gets older, so from childhood to adolescenthood, you'll have a lot of hormonal changes in your body. So then this special hormone called the gonadotropin releasing hormone, GnRH, which is secreted by the hypothalamus, it signals to the pituitary to release luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone in the end, which helps produce testosterone from the testes and estrogens and progesterone from the ovaries. And this doesn't necessarily mean testosterone is only produced by biological males. It can also be produced by females as well, because recall, testosterone can also be released by your adrenal glands as well. Okay. And as you progress into adolescenthood, these hormones will be upregulated and then will give you the secondary sex characteristics. So for males, for testosterone, estrogens for females. So typically, if you see female bodybuilders, testosterone is linked to muscle development. So they do have an increased amount of testosterone in their body, which gives them that increased muscle mass. And if you have further questions about exercise hormones and all that, feel free to send me an email. Be happy to talk to you about that. That's my field. All right. And of course, thyroid hormones are essential for the development of the human brain as well as the metabolic rate. So as you age, your metabolism does increase. However, if you reach a certain point, for example, menopausal stage for women, or above like 40, 50 for males, your metabolism does go down. So then it's all about playing with the numbers and the metabolic rate. Everybody's personalized. Everyone has their own certain amount of calories that they burn at resting state. So hormones do definitely play a key factor in your overall health. So now let's talk about mood. So when talking about thyroid, like I said, the thyroid is important for metabolic rate, but importantly, it does impact the serotonin system, because the more thyroid hormone you have, it increases serotonin neurotransmission. And from what we remember in previous classes, Serotonin, also known as 5-hydroxytryptamine, improves the communication between brain cells, which in turn lifts mood, reduces symptoms of depression. So, in a sense, for individuals who have hypothyroidism or low amounts of thyroid in their body, they will have a decrease in mood. So, in order to combat this, we have levothyroxine that we can give to individuals to help increase the amount of thyroid hormone in their body. But what's also interesting that, especially when we exercise, you know, especially in therapy or psychiatry, we tell individuals, we tell the patients like, hey, you should exercise more, get out more, because it's not just about losing weight, but it's also about the hormones that you produce in your body, right? So serotonin as well, right? But especially endocannabinoids. For example, anandamide, which is an analgesic. So an analgesics, think of it as a pain reliever. So it's also known as the runner's high. So it pretty much targets receptors called CB1, also CB2 to help relieve pain, improve mood, appetite, and sleep. So you notice people who constantly go to the gym or have an active lifestyle, they tend to be in a happier state. So, just even 5 minutes a day can make a difference, definitely. All right. So you have any questions? Let's see. All right, looks like they've been answered. Yes, so I agree. So for the recording, uh, so in terms of responsiveness to testosterone, it's higher in straight males than gay males, definitely. So it's ranked by males. So testosterone's higher in males, straight or gay, then lesbians, also termed butch, then lesbians who are more feminine, and also bisexual women as well. And the lowest amount of testosterone would be the straight woman. All right, so now we'll talk about brain structure and function. So this should just be some review from your lower division courses. We'll only go over a couple parts of the brain that is relevant to our course. So we'll talk about the cerebral cortex. We'll also talk about thalamus, the relay station, hypothalamus we pretty much talked about, as well as we'll also talk about the hindbrain as well down below. Okay. So just recall, the central nervous system is pretty much your brain and your spinal cord. Okay. So in human evolution, when you compare species, the development of the cerebral cortex differs from different species, other vertebrates, which gives us the ability to speak, to do fine motor tune movements, and to do a lot of creative things. So we'll just talk about certain parts of the brain here. So we'll talk about the hindbrain, midbrain, and forebrain. So let's talk about the hindbrain first. So right here, the hindbrain consists of the brainstem, the pons, which is ventral, the ventral area of the brain, cerebellum, which is the posterior part, and the medulla, which is inferior, right under the pons. So again, location for this course, don't need to know, but it's just for orientation, okay? So first, the medulla oblongata. So we all know it's all about breathing, it's autonomic, so we don't really have to think about. So typically regions of the brain that are towards the middle, we don't have to be aware about it because it's just an autonomic response. So medulla oblongata, involuntary, a lot of reflex reactions, regulation of heart rate, right? So it'll be here in the posterior part of the brain. So in the news, actually, there were a couple kids who were playing with barbecue skewers, and one of them actually accidentally hit one of their buddies in the back of the head, but it hit their medulla oblongata. So in the sense that that boy stopped breathing, leading to fatality. So it's really important to take care of your brain. So risk of TBI could be fatal because it can also affect your cerebral cortex. And we'll talk about the impacts of certain parts of your brain in the later slides. So next we have the pons. So that's superior to the medulla oblongata. So it's the relay station and also important for balance and coordination, right? So fun fact, one of the training concepts for exercise is balance training, because you have to be kinesthetically aware of your surroundings and of your movements in order to properly execute a movement or action. Okay. And we have, move my face over here. We also have the cerebellum. It's important for coordination and movement and spatial awareness. Okay, so this would be the hindbrain. Okay, so now we'll move on to the midbrain. So the midbrain, we have a couple parts of the midbrain that I want to talk about. So one of them would be the substantia nigra. So it's important portion of the basal ganglia, right? So here in the midbrain, the midbrain is important for movement. So especially when talking about Parkinson's disease, you'll notice Parkinsonian patients typically have a shuffling gait, they have cogwheel rigidity, they're unable to move properly, there's a lot of tremors that they display in their extremities, and Parkinson's disease is due to a loss of these cells. So as you can see here, the midbrain, we have the substantia nigra in a healthy individual, dark black. And in Parkinson's disease, you see that the substantia nigra cells are not really there. So in a sense, that's how scientists are able to decide which part of the brain affects certain hormones or actions or movements or regulatory processes. So now we also have the basal nuclei. So it's one of the top 2 dopamine producing areas of the brain. Basal nuclei will be around right here, just inferior to the substantia nigra. Also regulates voluntary movements as well. And like I said, with substantia nigra, basal nuclei, also Parkinson's disease is due to a loss of these cells. So take note of what part of the brain affects a certain disease, because that's what I'll be going over a lot in this lecture. So take note of that, okay? And the reticular formation helps keep the brain awake and alert, and to help with breathing and digestion as well. So you can just imagine what would happen if the reticular formation also, these cells would die off, right? You can't do normal functions. So as you age, you notice Parkinsonian patients, they can't really, their body can't really maintain the regulatory process in order to survive. Right? So does anyone know what type of drug would be given to patients who have Parkinson's disease? So if you have a lack of dopamine, does anyone know? So it would be L-DOPA, so it's levodopa, carbidopa. So it's pretty much similar to the structure of dopamine, but what's interesting, it is able to cross the blood-brain barrier. So in terms of producing drugs, the critical thing is to see if this drug will actually pass the blood-brain barrier, because a lot of molecules don't. And it's really, blood-brain barrier is really selective to certain molecules. Okay, so that's the midbrain. So now we'll talk about forebrain. So let's look at the cerebral cortex. So we talked a lot about the limbic system in terms of emotion, memory, and learning, and the fear conditioning response. So we look at the amygdala. So the amygdala is important for emotional awareness and expression. So once you get scared, or say you've experienced a traumatic experience like 9/11, that flashbulb memory, so it will, those memories would occur throughout your brain. However, amygdala is mainly for that recollection of the memories that you've experienced at the time, which is especially in high stressful situations, especially those who are in combat. And we also have the hippocampus, important for memory formation and recall memories. So the misconception, if you decide to further do research in memory, hippocampus, you do form the memories there. However, if you want to put those memories, like if you're studying for this course, in a long-term state, you have to consolidate those memories in the cortex, so the other parts of your brain. So if you're a visual learner, if you're watching the pictures that I have on the screen, if you're listening to my voice explaining the concepts, you'll definitely understand it better for the long term, okay? And we'll look at some case studies to see what happens if the hippocampus was removed. Then we have the thalamus, the relay station. So like at the airport, the thalamus is pretty much that the airplane tower, right? So it just pretty much tells the body like, hey, we need to process this. Let's send the signal over here to this part of the brain, all right? So now let's look at some research studies. So when we look at split brain research, studies show that women's two hemispheres are more integrated, so they listen with both sides. What that means is that they have more white matter in their brains, and the white matter, recall, versus gray matter, the gray matter are more the cell bodies. The white matter, it's the reason why it's white is because they are myelinated axons, so they're able to make a lot of connections back and forth. So you'll notice that, you know, women tend to be more observant. They'll listen, they'll remember anything and everything you say. Trust me, everything. So don't try to act dumb and be like, oh, I never said that. And you're like, oh, sure, let me look at my history, right? So they'll remember everything. Trust me. And what we notice that the right hemisphere especially is important for sexual pleasure and orgasm. So we'll look at the differences between the left and right hemisphere. And for males, like for example, if we look at studies for males, all the brain areas are lowered and decreased, except for the right frontal cortex, where blood flow increases significantly, right? So studies like this can tell us which parts of the brain is important for what function. And smell as well, right here. So the olfactory bulb, which is ventral, the ventral area of the brain. Smell triggers arousal and sexual response. So fun fact, so for males, like we can be aroused by like cinnamon, lavender. Oh, let me tell you, whenever I walk through Cinnabon, I won't get anything, but I would always look. I would just like window shop because I really love the smell of cinnamon. So if you ever want to attract a mate, you know, you could probably have these scents, you know, these perfumes like pumpkin pie perfume or football scented perfume, something like that. But yeah, so when we look at the left and right hemisphere, so we think of the left hemisphere, we think of logical or those processes to help interpret the world that makes sense. And the right tends to be more creative, as you can see here in this picture, where we would tend to have a lot of emotion on the right side of our hemisphere, recognize faces, gives us a response to say like, oh, hey, it's my good friend. But on the left, that's more important for speaking. So we can look at here, we'll look at the Broca's area and the Wernicke's area are only on the left hemisphere of the brain. So the Broca's area, if you have damage to the Broca's area, you'll have expressive aphasia, broken speech, or unable to communicate with someone else what you're thinking. And the Wernicke's area is receptive aphasia. So as you can see here in the temporal lobe, someone says something to you, you'll comprehend it at a definitely like a different interpretation. So we have patients that have damage to these areas of the brain, and people may think they're psychotic, but no, it's just a neurological impact on their brain. So that's why we really have to take care of our heads and also consider the impact of TBI, traumatic brain injuries. So when we look at the split brain, right? So whatever's on the left side, left hemisphere, usually the action would be on our right side. So my left brain would be the one, if I'm right-handed, I'll be writing with my right hand. Versus if on my right hemisphere, it's probably inverted on your screen, but you get what I mean. So, right, especially here, the optic chiasma, we can see that the left visual field and right visual field will be impacted if you have damage to the left or right hemisphere. Especially when talking about the corpus callosum, right, which brings those connections together, okay? Because we need to interpret, we'll sense something, then we got to interpret it, right? So it's a bunch of neural networks. All right, now we'll look at some lobes really quick. So the occipital lobe, we'll always think about vision. It's in the posterior part of your head. And of course, if you have damage to your striate cortex, which is in the most posterior point of your head, you'll have trouble with your vision. And if you suffer eye damage or become blind, pretty much having an intact occipital cortex, and you'll still remember things if you had vision before, because in previous visual experience, you can still have those visual scenes and can still have visual dreams you can imagine in your head. So now we'll talk about the temporal lobe. We usually think about auditory functions and processes. So in terms of learning languages or even dyslexia, it's important, like especially as the brain grows, if you want your child to learn new languages, teach them at a young age, because they'll develop in that area and have more neural outputs in order to develop that language. And when we look at dyslexia, people think it's like, oh, it's the occipital lobe, but actually it's the temporal lobe, because it's about analyzing the words, right? The temporal-parietal area decodes the sound as the letters and words, and is much less active in people with dyslexia. Okay, it's all about phonetic awareness. And the parietal lobe, what's important about the parietal lobe is the somatosensory cortex. So the postcentral gyrus, I'll show in a later slide, pretty much we see this homunculus. So the bigger the part of the body that's there, the more neurons that are there, the more sensors that are there. So you'll notice your lips, your hands, your fingers, they're bigger on the homunculus, because you need to have the fine motor movements to find sensations and all that. And different parts of this cortex is important for a certain part of the body. So if you have damage here, then you'll have damage to your nose, right? So a study here provided that unilateral spatial neglect is not only a disorder of visual perception, but also can affect mental representations, such that patients fail to report the left side of scenes or objects in mental imagery. So if you give a task to someone who has damage in that part of the brain, then they cannot complete the image because they just cannot process it. So this is pretty much what this study shows. So I see I have a couple minutes left. So again, yeah, somatosensory cortex. It's important for understanding phantom limb syndrome. So during amputation, peripheral nerves are severed, but this results in massive tissue and neuronal injury, causing disruption of the normal pattern of nerve inputs to the spinal cord. So even if your limb's not there, you'll still perceive your limb being there, and your body's like, oh, something's wrong, my leg's not there, so I perceive pain. Okay, lastly, the frontal lobe. It's important for executive functioning and higher processing. So it's important for conducting motor functions. So you see the precentral gyrus, which is right here, which is important for processing movements. And we have a lot of dendrites in this area, which is why a lot of movements you conduct happen because of your frontal cortex. And some cool psychiatric disorders, if your frontal cortex is too active, tend to have OCD, because you just can't shut off goal playing. Like, I have to get this done. I have to touch the doorknob a certain amount of times, right? But it's also inactive in antisocial personality disorder, right? They just, their personality would just change. They wouldn't really feel any sympathy or anything like that. And we have patient HM. So I talked about the hippocampus. So pretty much what it states is, if your hippocampus is removed, you cannot form new memories. However, patient HM was still able to recall certain events in the past because memories were consolidated in his cortex. And we have Phineas Gage, who's important because it showed scientists that, hey, the frontal lobe controls personality, because a rod got hit his anterior frontal lobe, and people thought, oh, he's brain dead. But it's actually, it actually controls personality, because he was able to function, but how he interacts with people was way, way different. So we'll go through neurotransmitters fairly quickly. So endorphins, so it makes you feel good, pretty much. Pleasure and pain, natural opiates. But what's interesting, with people who have thoughts of self-harm, the reason why they cut their arm is because they want that that rush of endorphins to cope with the stress, right? So endorphins get released, especially when you're in pain. So that's why patients, they're not suicidal, but they just want to inflict pain because they just want to relieve their stress. Acetylcholine, we all know it's about muscle contraction and movement. So people use Botox because if you have Botox, it'll decrease acetylcholine levels, which will keep your face kind of like in like a mask. So in a sense, you're all plumped up and your muscles won't contract. So that's why it stays really fit and no wrinkles would occur. And also known in myasthenia gravis, especially those who have Alzheimer's disease, you'll notice that their face start to droop if you have decrease in acetylcholine levels. And also norepinephrine, it's important for arousal, alertness. You recall epinephrine, norepinephrine, it's all about the stress response. There's catecholamines, especially for PTSD. So an increase of norepinephrine might trigger and re-experience the stressors that these individuals experienced in the past. So what usually we give people prazosin to help with their nightmares because it lowers the amount of norepinephrine in their body. We have glutamate, which is excitatory. It's important for action potentials, learning, memory. But what happens if you have too much glutamate? Then there'll be consequences as well, right? Because you don't want to be too active, because then that will lead to insomnia. So what's important is you need to have GABA, which is the main inhibitory neurotransmitter in the central nervous system. So glutamate enhances action potentials, GABA inhibits. And lastly, glucose, which is your primary brain fuel. Your brain does use ketone bodies at starvation, but mainly glucose. So whenever you're on a ketogenic diet, for example, you'll lack that amount of energy because glucose is the primary source of fuel to your brain. And if you have too much blood sugar in your body, you need to have insulin in order to have your cells take the glucose in, because you don't want it to stay in your blood sugar in your blood too long, because that would be fatal. And of course, it's important to reuptake and regulate these hormones, right? Because like I said about glutamate, if you have too much, it might lead to insomnia, but also serotonin. People think, oh, serotonin's amazing, but actually too much serotonin, also called serotonin syndrome, may lead to extreme nerve activity, right? Rapid heart rate, loss of control of muscles, so it can be fatal. So it's important to discontinue medications like SSRIs, like Lexapro or Celexa, and maybe give periactin to prevent the body from making too much serotonin. And lastly, to go over some brain scans really briefly, just to know the differences and when to use them. So MRI, pretty much to create a 3D representation of the brain. It's safe, doesn't use x-rays, but it's good at catching epilepsy, schizophrenia, and degeneration. As you can see here, the healthy individual versus schizophrenic brain, you see that the ventricles of the brain right here in the middle is pretty much like not there. So you can kind of detect like, okay, this person is schizophrenic. But then if you use a functional MRI, you record brain processes moment by moment. So subtle changes in oxygen levels. So you can see here the schizophrenic brain. So blood flow flows to these areas right here in red. Right, so just to reiterate, MRI versus fMRI. MRI is usually high resolution, fMRI is usually moment by moment. So it's kind of like, it looks a little grainy. CT or CAT scans, the same thing, stands for computerized axial tomography. So it's important to detect tumors and other structural abnormalities. You can see the damage caused by stroke or depression. You can see here. As well as PET. If we look at here, positron emission tomography, also able to detect cancerous tissues, but it's also used hand in hand with a CT or CAT scan to have a more defined image, as you can see here. CT image is kind of poor, but the fused CT and PET image, you can see like, oh, there's the tumor. Also here in Parkinson's disease, right, remember the midbrain, you can kind of see that it's pretty much not there. The death of these cells cause Parkinsonian symptoms. See here in bright red, so there's a decrease in the midbrain. And lastly, the EEG, electroencephalograph, cortisol activity of neurons, so you can recognize alcoholism, depression, dementia, but interestingly, antisocial personality disorder, because there's an increase in theta waves in people who have antisocial personality. So recall, asocial and antisocial are completely different things. You not wanting to hang out with friends or going out, that's asocial, okay, not antisocial. So asocial is more like criminals, feel lack of remorse or guilt, right? So it's like they're in a deep sleep or a dream state. And I believe Tiffany will talk about the sleep lecture. So if you're curious to learn more, then we'll discuss this for, later in class as well. So here's a summary of some cool neurotransmitters. Hopefully I didn't go too fast, but just recall the important points is to see what parts of the brain impacts certain parts of the body and certain diseases that are important. So the pathology of these hormones. Also, SHINE protocol to help maintain health and chronic fatigue syndrome. SHINE, sleep, it's important. Hormones, immunity infections, nutrition, and exercise. And if you're really interested with health and well-being and trying not to gain weight, the Obesity Code highly recommends a really good book to educate you and kind of think about the hormonal processes in your body, because people think it's calories in, calories out. It's actually more than that, because it's everyone is personalized and their approach to health. All right, that's it.
Thank you, Brian. It was excellent. Thank you for all of your information. Just really great job, man. And it's been a joy working with you these last several years and everything. Glad you guys get to see Brian today present. And I'll see you guys on Friday. So have a great rest of your day. Make sure if you go out to practice, being sanitary and stuff, and wear your mask. And see you guys Friday. Also, for office hours, I'll join on there at 11:10. So it'll be 11:10. All right. See you guys.